want you to look at the first three words of that verse, 2 Peter 1:3. His divine power. That's an awesome set of words. His divine power. They're awesome words, and they're intriguing words, because so much of the frustration of life comes from not having the power we need. Whenever there's a failure in your life, that's a lack of power. And we know that God makes His power available to us as His children, and yet we just seem to have so little of it so often. But how can that be? How can it ever be that we lack power, given what Peter says here? Because verse 3 says, His divine power has given us everything we need. And the word everything is emphatic in the Greek. It's the very first word in the sentence. Everything. Absolutely everything we need. If I have the same precious, grade A, 24-karat faith that the apostles had, and I've been given absolutely everything I need, then why do I seem to have so little power in my life? Why so much failure all the time? And for that matter, why does Peter, if this is true, why does Peter even keep writing after verse 3? Why didn't he just end the book right there? If I have faith, I have everything I need. What else is there? Well, the answer is this. You have everything you need to reach the goal, but that doesn't mean you've reached it. Verse 3, His divine power has given us everything we need for, literally it's toward, then he tells you what the goal is. So the word toward there makes it clear that having everything you need is not the point. It's not the end point. It's not the goal. It just means you have all the necessary tools to reach the goal. The faith that you've been given is just a starting point. That's the raw material. That's the way 2 Peter, in 2 Peter, that's the way he talks about faith, the beginning point. In verse 1, he tells us, you've been given this gift of faith. Then in verse 5, skip down to verse 5, it says, therefore, make every effort to add to your faith. And that's the last time he mentions faith in the book. That's it. You're not going to hear about it again. He doesn't mention it again because 2 Peter is not a book about the starting point. It's a book about the goal. That's what he wants to talk about. So let's talk about the goal. In fact, we'll talk about three things tonight. First, we're going to talk about the purpose of the power, the goal of this power. Second, the need for the power. And third, access to the power. How do you get it? So first, the purpose of the power. What's the goal? A fun question to sometimes people ask each other is, if you could have one superpower, which would it be? What superpower would you like to have? But it's a fun question, but a lot more important question is, if you had a superpower, what would you do with it? What would you use it for? Because we've been given superpower. More than that, divine power is what it says here. Question is, for what? What's it for? What is God's purpose in giving this power? What does He want us to accomplish with it? And the answer is just in the rest of the sentence. His divine power has given us everything we need toward, here comes the goal, life and godliness. Life and godliness. And that's a big goal. The reason God made His divine power available to us to give us everything we need to reach the goal of life and godliness. At least that's one way of describing the goal. The goal is so important. It's so important to Peter that we understand what this goal is, that he's going to describe different aspects of this goal in each one of these opening verses. So he describes it one way in verse 1, then another way here in verse 3, another way in verse 4, and then another way in verses 5 to 7. And each description gives us a fuller, richer, deeper insight. He wants to show us this goal from every angle, so we see every facet of it. So we get this really full-orbed, rich, thorough understanding of exactly what it is we're trying to accomplish. Where are we going? What is the purpose of this power, this divine power? The way he described it back in verse 2, if you remember, is a whole lot of grace and peace. Grace and peace and abundance. We covered that last time. The way he's going to describe it in verse 4 is escaping the corruption of the world and sharing in the divine nature. In verses 5 to 8, the way he describes the goal is to grow in this whole list of virtues, you add your faith, goodness, knowledge, self-control, perseverance, godliness, brotherly kindness, and love. These are all various ways of describing the goal of living a life that's in line with the nature of God, basically, is how you could sum all those up. Just living that kind of life. That's the goal. It says it different in each verse. The way he says it here in verse 3 is life and godliness. So that's what we're going to focus on tonight. Start with godliness. The Greek word behind godliness is a hard word to translate because there's no English equivalent. In fact, not only is there not an equivalent word, there's not even an equivalent idea in English or in our culture. The concept behind this word, it was a very common concept back then. Everybody understood it, and it wasn't unusual, but it's so completely foreign to our culture that we don't have a word for it, and nobody even thinks along these lines. In fact, when I studied this word, I finally got a handle on what it means. I realized I didn't even have a category for this word in my mind. I don't think like this. It's just a new way of thinking for me, but it's such a beautiful concept. I found this so helpful. In fact, of all the points in this study, this is probably the number one takeaway for me, is this meaning of this word. The Greek word is eusebia, or eusebia. And a short definition of this word might be living in the presence of God. Just living in the presence of God. But it's a lot richer than just that. Godliness refers to the lifestyle, the way you live, the lifestyle that comes from a proper attitude toward God. It's the lifestyle that comes from a proper attitude. That attitude piece is the key. It's not just knowing the truth about God. It's having the right attitude toward those truths. And it's not just having proper attitudes, but it's the lifestyle that results from having those proper attitudes towards the truths about God. So it's a way of living and behaving that happens when you feel the right way about God. Godliness is a way of living and behaving that happens when you feel the right way about God. So you just kind of take all that huge definition, and it takes a lot of words to define it because we just don't have this concept. But if you put it all together, I think what it boils down to this. Godliness is when three things. Number one, you're aware of God's presence. Number two, you feel the right way about it in the moment. And number three, you act accordingly. You're aware of God's presence. You feel the right way. You have the right attitude about it in the moment. And then you act accordingly. You live that way. So a lot of times you'll see this word, eusebia, you'll see it translated either godliness or sometimes piety. They'll describe it as piety because I think they say that because that's the most obvious attitude that you should have in the presence of God, right, is reverence. So maybe a shortcut definition for this word, if I can just kind of help get the concept in your mind, is godliness is the way you act in church. Okay? It's the way you act. Now that's not a perfect definition because people commit all kinds of sins in church and people have all kinds of wrong attitudes about God in church, but you get the idea. At your best in church, when you look at the kind of language people use at church, and you see the way they behave, and the way they treat each other, and talk to each other, and the attitude of reverence and worship, obviously maybe some of that's pride, and maybe they're trying to impress people and all that, but if you just think of people at their best, Christians at their best at church, the way their attitude and the way they live, that's godliness. That's godliness. That's the idea. So, the past couple of weeks, whenever I consider some attribute of God, I ask myself, okay, what's the appropriate attitude to have towards God right now, given this attribute that's fitting, given this attribute? And then I remind myself, God's right here. He's right here, right now. He has that attribute. How should I be feeling in the presence of a being like that who has that attribute? And as I ask the question, I can feel my attitude adjust in the right direction, in the direction of that attitude that's the correct attitude. And it's resulted, for me, in a much richer kind of fellowship with God than what I was having before. So, like I say, for me, that's a big takeaway from this study. So that's godliness. That's what godliness means. Peter pairs that word with the word life. Life and godliness. Peter does that. He likes to combine pairs of words in a way that kind of combine to make one idea. Two words for a single idea. So the idea here is, I think that's what he's doing here. So the idea is a living, thriving, flourishing, growing godliness. Godliness that's alive. I think that's what life and godliness means. And that living, growing, thriving part points us to what I believe is the main theme of the book of 2 Peter. We didn't really have time for this last time, but 2 Peter, the goal is not just godliness. It would seem like that would be enough, right? If you're godly, it seems like, okay, that's, if you could say, yeah, now I'm godly, well, that's pretty good, right? Peter's like, nope, that's not enough. That's not enough. Peter assumes you're already godly. His purpose in this book is all about growth in that godliness. More godliness. More and more godliness. And when I say that's the theme of the book, let me just give you a quick 4-minute overview of 2 Peter. So I'll just give you this. This is what the book teaches in 4 minutes. And I can do that because this is an easy book to summarize, because 2 Peter, unlike other books that cover lots of different topics, 2 Peter basically has one main thrust. So we can sum it up. So here we go. If I had to sum up the entire book of 2 Peter in a single word, it would probably be the word more. More. Whatever you have from God, Peter wants you to have more. No matter where you are in your faith, Peter wants you to grow beyond that point. Keep growing, getting more and more and more. Look at verse 5. For this very reason, make every effort to do what? Add to your faith. And then he gives this big long list of virtues. Add. And then to your faith, knowledge. And add to that. And add to that. And add to that. Start with faith. Keep on adding and adding and adding and adding. And that list in verses 5 to 7 is an amazing list, right? Knowledge, self-control, perseverance, godliness, brotherly kindness, love, all that stuff. Can you imagine if you had all those virtues? Like if somebody described you and it's like, oh, what's he like? What's she like? And they used that list. Somebody said, oh, lots of perseverance, lots of self-control, lots of love. You're just like, whoa, that's great. Peter says, no, not enough. Not enough. Even if you had all those virtues, get this, even if you had all those virtues, you would still be, according to Peter, ineffective and unproductive in your knowledge of Christ unless those virtues were increasing. That's what he says in verse 8. Look at verse 8. 2 Peter 1:8. For if you possess these qualities in increasing measure, they will keep you from becoming ineffective and unproductive. They have to be growing. So Peter's objective, more, grow. You even see it in the opening greeting. I mean, look back at the opening greeting. All the other Bible writers, they write a book, they start out, grace and peace to you. Not Peter. For Peter, grace and peace be multiplied to you. Right? More, lots of it. I want you to have tons of it. And you see it again here in verse 3. Not just godliness, living, growing. Godliness, that's what this book is about. Growth, making progress, getting more and more of all that God offers. So that's why I say my summary of this book is the word more, or grow. But forget about my summary, how I would sum it up. Look at how Peter sums up his own book. Look, go to the very last verse in the whole book. Very last verse, 2 Peter 3:18. Last thing he wants to leave you with before he goes, last thing he wants ringing in your ears, here it is. But grow in the grace and knowledge of our Lord Jesus Christ. Grow. That's his last word. It's all about growing. Why? Why, Peter? Why is it so important that we grow? I mean, what is it? What is he so exercised about when these readers that he's writing to? Is it because they're a bunch of weak, immature Christians, like the readers of Hebrews and 1 Corinthians that couldn't handle solid food, just milk, and they're immature, just a bunch of babies? No. In fact, 2 Peter is a book that actually explicitly states that it is written specifically to solid, knowledgeable, established Christians. This is a book that's 1 Corinthians, written to immature Christians. Hebrews, immature. 2 Peter, it's written to mature Christians. 2 Peter 1:12, look at verse 12. So I will always remind you of these things, even though you know them, you're knowledgeable, and are firmly established in the truth that you now have. You're solid. You're strong. These people he's writing to are solid. So why is Peter so concerned about making sure that these rock-solid Christians keep on growing and keep on growing from where they are now? Answer, so that they never fall away. That's in verse 10. If you do these things, you will never fall. That's his purpose. Again, you go to the end of the book, second to last verse, 2 Peter 3:17. Since you already know this, be on your guard so that you will not be carried away by the error of lawless men and fall from your secure position. So these people he's writing to, they're strong, they're steadfast, they're knowledgeable, but they could still fall from that steadfastness. And so then the whole middle of the book of 2 Peter is all about the various spiritual threats that can bring about that fall. And the thing that will keep you from falling, when you face all these dangers at the end of chapter 1, all through chapter 2, beginning of chapter 3, all these spiritual dangers, the thing that's going to keep you from ever falling when you face those is being godly? No. What will keep you from falling is growing in godliness. Growing in godliness. When the end times come, and there's a mass apostasy, and the love of Christ the love of most grows cold, and Jesus says, will the Son of Man even find faith on the earth, and all that. All those people are going to fall away. Who are all those people falling away? Just baby Christians? No, they're people at all levels of godliness who just simply stopped growing. And that's why Peter is so exercised about telling these seasoned, strong, godly Christians that they must keep on growing, don't ever stall out. Okay, so that's my quick 4-minute summary of 2 Peter. Keep growing in godliness so that you'll never fall when the pressures hit. I wanted to show you that so that you can see how our verse today, verse 3, is the foundation. It lays the foundation for the whole book. We started out with God's divine power. What is the purpose of all this amazing divine superpower that God has made available? The goal, what is the goal? That we have everything we need to attain this goal? The answer, living, growing, multiplying, building godliness. That's the purpose of the power. Okay, so that's point 1, purpose of the power. Now let's move to the second point, the need for the power. So the purpose, what's the need? When you see that the goal is godliness and virtues like goodness and knowledge and self-control and love and kindness, the natural response that we typically have for that is when God says, okay, that's where I want you to be, our natural response is, oh wow, that's a pretty tall order. I'm going to have to roll up my sleeves and just really work hard at this. That's the natural response, and it's a response that will doom you to failure. Whenever you study the Bible, every phrase, you always ask, why is that there? Okay? Why is that phrase there? And I ask that about this phrase. Let's ask it. Why does he start with his divine power? Why does he say that? What would happen if it was removed? How would it change the meaning? I mean, he could have just said, God has given us everything we need for life and godliness. Nothing wrong with that, right? God has given us everything we need. Why didn't he say that? Why does he say his divine power has given us everything we need? Why the emphasis on power? I believe the answer to that is this. Tying it to divine power, pointing us to the power involved, puts us in the right frame of mind to understand what sort of goal this really is, what sort of task we're being called to. I want you to imagine something. Imagine God came to your house and said, okay, I've got a job for you. And I have provided what's required for you to get it done, the tool you're going to need. It's all required. It's set out for you. I've got it right out front. Follow me. And so you follow him out there, and you look, the whole front yard is taken up by this gigantic jet engine, size of a bus, sitting in your front yard. I just like, that's the tool I'm going to need? Yep. Isn't that a bit much, God? Nope. In fact, you're going to need 4 of those. And then he takes you to the job site, and here's this big, giant jumbo jet sitting there. And God says, okay, here's your task. I want you to get that thing off the ground. I want you to lift that jumbo jet off the ground. How high off the ground? Oh, about 5 miles. 5 miles off the ground. Oh, boy. And so you take a deep breath. You roll up your sleeves, you squat down so you're lifting with your back and not your legs and not your back, and you heave that, and of course it doesn't budge. And so you say, oh, this thing is so heavy. I'm going to have to hit the gym hard. And God knew you would have that hit the gym attitude, and that's why he started this whole thing out by saying, no, not hit the gym. Jet engine. That's what you're going to need. He wants you to get an idea of the size of the task. That's what Peter's doing when he starts out with these words, his divine power has given us everything we need for this task. He's saying, get this in your head right up front. When I tell you what the goal is here, don't think about your biceps. Don't think about your willpower. Think about jet engines. His divine power is... Think big. It's a massive task, this goal of godliness. But there's a problem with that jetliner illustration. If God showed you a 747 and told you this needs to go 5 miles in the sky, it would never even occur to you to try to lift it with your own muscles. You wouldn't even try that. That'd be stupid. You would automatically know, of course this requires a jet engine. So forget that illustration. It's a dumb story. And if God's told you, okay, the goal is I want you to go out there and raise the dead and walk on water and stop hurricanes with a word and all this, then you would say, boy, that's going to require divine power. It wouldn't even occur to you to try to do that in your own strength. But we don't naturally realize that when it comes to this spiritual goal: godliness, love, self-control, perseverance. Those things look to us like, they look a lot more like a heavy barbell than a 747. Maybe it's a really heavy barbell, so we have to, we're just like, ooh, boy, self-control? Even when there's high fructose corn syrup out there, self-control, that's a heavy barbell. That's going to be tough. I'm going to have to hit the gym, right? I'm going to have to study some self-help books, get some reminders on my phone, maybe snap a rubber band on my wrist to get my, accountability partner, a sticky note on my mirror, and, all these techniques. I'm going to hit the gym. This is going to be tough. And we do all that, and this big 747 doesn't even budge. It goes nowhere. And we keep trying and failing, and trying and failing, and trying and failing. And finally we're like, this is impossible. It's impossible. Well, is it possible? Yeah, it's possible, but if you want to get that thing off the ground, you're going to have to use those jet engines. Nothing else is going to get that thing in the sky. All those techniques, the sticky notes, the rubber band, all that, they have a place. Once you're in that plane and flying, it'll help you with the steering and everything, but it's not going to have the power to get that thing off the ground. You're going to need the jet engines. You're going to need divine power. And it's a hard concept for us because these things seem human. They seem attainable. They seem possible. If you just had some willpower, you just worked at it. And Peter's like, no, don't even think that way. Think about jet engines. Peter's not the only one that makes this point. Ephesians 3:17, Paul does the same thing when he's talking about he wants them to understand Christ's love. And you're just like, okay, Paul, if you want me to understand Christ's love, how about you just teach me about Christ's love? And he's like, no, you don't understand. This isn't a barbell. This is a 747. So he's Ephesians 3:17. I pray that you may have the power to grasp how wide and long and high and deep is the love of Christ. This is something to Christ's divine power, big time jet engines. When you try to make changes to your character, and it's a struggle, and you think, ah, man, I just got to try harder. That won't get you anywhere but frustrated. His power is plenty to get the job done. So if the job isn't getting done, you're not tapping into His power. Does that make sense? His power is enough. So if it's not happening, then you're not... Whenever something isn't working in your spiritual life, it's because you're not using the jet engines. Never strain harder to do the job. Only strain harder to fire up those jet engines. That's where the effort needs to go. And that takes a lot of effort. Well, what is the effort? How is that done? What are the controls that flip on the switches for those jet engines? I mean, because we've seen the purpose of the power, and now we understand the need for the power. We need it. We see the goal of it, and we understand we really need it. One last point, how to get it. How to access the power. How do you turn on the jet engines? And that's a crucial question because every Christian starts with the same wonderful, high-quality, 24-karat faith, right? Every Christian has been given everything he needs or she needs for life and godliness and growing in life and godliness. But not every Christian is doing it. We've all been given the faith. We've all been given everything we need. We're not all doing it. So in fact, down in verses 8 and 9, Peter says that. He makes it clear. Some Christians are growing in godliness. Others aren't. So what is it that we need to tap into divine superpower and make all this start to happen? Well, Peter already told us in verse 2 in the greeting. He'll tell us again here in verse 3. Then he's going to bring it up again and again all through the book and then remind us one last time in the very last verse of the book. So, in case you miss it, you'll get it the next time. Verse 3, here it is. His divine power has given us everything we need for life and godliness through, here comes, here's how you activate that divine power, the knowledge of Him. The jumbo jet of Christian growth only gets off the ground through the jet engines called His divine power, and the switch that fires up those engines is knowledge of God. That's the key to getting divine power into your life, knowing God more deeply. And like I said, it's a huge theme in Peter. We're only in verse 3. It's already the second time he said it. In the Greek, there's actually a connecting word between the greeting in verse 2, which is really unusual. Other writers don't do this. But there's a connecting word connecting the greeting in verse 2 to the main body in verse 3 that could be translated just as. So it kind of sounds like this. Verse 2, grace and peace be yours in abundance through knowledge of God, just as His divine power has given us everything we need for life and godliness through the knowledge of Him. So what he's saying there is the way you get abundant grace and peace is through knowledge of God, because the way you get everything is through knowledge of God. It all comes through that. And so when I say this is a theme, 16 times in 3 little chapters in 2 Peter, you're going to see this word knowledge. So get ready for this word. This is a big time word. And then I told you the last verse, very last verse of the book. Here it is again. Grow in the grace and knowledge of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. It's the last thing he says because it's the most important key to everything. That's what turns on those engines. Grow in knowledge. Starts with it, ends with it, repeats it again and again through the book. Peter doesn't want you to miss the keys that are going to turn on the jet engine. If something is going wrong in your spiritual life, the solution is always deepening your knowledge of God. If you have a spiritual goal, you will reach that goal by means of greater knowledge of God. If you want to escape some sin, develop a virtue, draw nearer to God's presence, get more grace from God, protect yourself from being deceived and falling away, it all comes through greater knowledge of God. That's how you activate the divine superpower. Now, what is the knowledge of God? As you might guess, there's a lot more to it than just knowing about God. I know a lot of information about the President of the United States. I don't know him personally. So knowing someone personally, it's a relational knowledge. It's also an experiential knowledge, and it's a marvelous reality. There's so much to it. I'm going to have to wait to, we'll just cover that in a separate session so we can get into detail on all the richness of this concept of knowledge of God. But for now, we'll just say it's way more than just knowing information about God, but it does start with information about God. You have to, you can't know someone intimately if you don't know anything about them. So that's the starting place. And you can never have a relational knowledge or experiential knowledge of God without knowing truth about God. There can be no relationship with God without theology. None. None. And so at the end of verse 3, Peter's going to give us some information about God. He's going to give us one crucially important truth about God that'll get us started in knowing Him more deeply. And if you're looking for an attribute of God that you can kind of camp on and learn to experience, that will really do a lot to give you power to grow in godliness, this is a great place to start, this particular attribute. Peter says His divine power has given us everything we need for life and godliness through our knowledge of Him, who? Okay, here's what you need to know about God. This one who called us by His own glory and excellence. Maybe that's more like 3 attributes, but he kind of combines them all together. So first, He called us. Knowing that God called you is essential for knowing God, because it reminds you what sort of relationship you have. It's a relationship where He initiated the relationship. He called you. God is not like some celebrity that is gracious enough to give you an autograph when you finally manage to get close enough to Him. He sought you out. He came after you. He called you. When you're trying to draw near to God, it helps to remember that He wants you to succeed. When you're trying to draw near to God, it helps to remember that. He wants me to succeed. He's the one that called me to Him in the first place. The only reason you became a Christian on the day you became a Christian, I mean, have you ever wondered that? Why not the day before that? Why not the day after that? Why did it happen on that day? It happened on that day because, and it didn't happen on the day before or the day after, because that was the day that God called you in a way that He knew you would respond to. You know, like somebody has a dog and they know just how to call that dog where it'll always come running. He knows, God knows how to speak to you that way. His sheep know His voice. They will respond to it. So Jesus, on that day, He's called you in that special way. That special call. What is that special way? What was the way? For like a man calling his dog, he might use a specific tone of voice or volume or whatever. What was it for you? That tone of voice that God used to get you to respond, what was it? Well, He tells us here. He called us by means of His own glory and excellence. That's the way God called you to get you to respond. The day before you became a Christian, you might have known a whole bunch of information about God, but it was on that day, the day you were saved, it was on that day that He opened your eyes to see His glory and excellence. And that attracted you to Him. When you saw Him, when you saw His glory, when you saw His excellence, that made you say, oh, I want that. I want that more than I want my old life. That's why you became a Christian. And when it says His own glory and goodness, it's pointing us to this. In fact, this is His very nature. Glory and excellence aren't just things He does. This is who He is. So interacting with His glory and interacting with His excellence is interacting with Him. And I think this is another example of Peter. Remember I said he likes to couple 2 words together to make one idea? I think this glory and excellence is another example of that. One of them means moral perfection. The other one means radiance. Glory means radiance. And so the idea is it's the radiance and splendor of His moral perfection. The radiance and splendor of His moral perfection. That's how God attracted you to Him when He called you. You saw it through his word, through the gospel, through the creation, through his other works. You saw it. And you got a good enough glimpse of his glory and moral excellence where you say, I want that. I want that more than I want in my old life. That's why you became a Christian. So, can you see Peter's point here? He's saying the way for you to grow spiritually, keep on growing in godliness and all these other virtues, is through knowledge of God. And one thing about God that'll help you really deepen your knowledge of God is to remember that he, number one, initiated the relationship with you. And number two, he did that by exposing his moral excellence to you in a way that you couldn't resist it. That's important because if your goal is to get to know God better, then that will happen now the same way it happened back when you first became a Christian, by seeing his glory more. If you want more spiritual growth, more self-control, more love, more kindness, that won't come until you get a clearer view of his magnificence, his moral magnificence. You need to see it clearly enough to where you're more attracted to it than you already are. You become more attracted to it than you already are. That's how you grow. That will increase your knowledge of God. And it'll give you more superpower, more access to God's divine power. That's what will free you from enslaving sins. That's what will enable you to love God more and to love people more. And enable you to draw near to God more. All of it. And by the way, this is also the best way to win others to the Lord. Since this is the method he used on us, maybe this is the method we should use on others. So the effective way to win the lost is not shooting down all their dumb arguments. The best way to win the lost is by showing them the glory of Christ and what's amazing about his attributes. Oh, you reject Christianity because you think the church is full of hypocrites and you were mistreated by some Christians? Okay, fine. But let's just set that aside for a second and talk about the Christ you're rejecting. What do you think about him? Let's talk about what he's like. You think I'm a moron? Oh, okay, well, I won't argue with you there, but what about Jesus? Do you think he's a moron? You know, that can be a very powerful question to ask an unbeliever. I've asked that to atheists before, and it often will stop them in their tracks. Do you think Jesus was a moron? Do you think he was a fool? Or do you admit that no one in history ever spoke like this man? Ever. And his words routinely changed the lives of millions of people 2,000 years later. Are you going to argue with the brilliance of the Sermon on the Mount? Feel free to ask anyone that question. Are you going to argue with the brilliance of the Sermon on the Mount? Can you impugn anything Jesus ever said or did? What about God's mind-boggling wisdom? I mean, just look at the creation. The wisdom behind it. How can you ignore the vast, superhuman intelligence behind the creation? Or the beauty and magnificence that the author of all the world's beauty and magnificence must have? What about his incredible patience? Or how forgiving he is? Or his compassion? Or the fact that his presence satisfies the deepest cravings of the human soul when nothing in the world will? How do you explain the experiences of the presence of God, that what they've done in my life? Here, let me tell you about them. When you try to bring a person to Christ, he's not going to hear God's call until he sees God's moral excellence and perfection. He's not going to respond to God's call until he sees God's glory. In my opinion, we don't spend nearly enough time talking about God, what God is like. In the church, in our personal conversations, in books, in Christian fiction, nonfiction, podcasts, song lyrics, not near enough time talking about what God is like. Whether you're sharing the gospel with an unbeliever or just trying to encourage a friend, a brother, a sister in Christ, trying to strengthen a mature Christian, the most effective way to do it is by showing that person the glory of Christ. Do it by going beyond the obvious when you talk about his attributes. Think a little deeper than you normally do and share what you find. That's one way people can see God's glory and excellence. It's just by you telling them. Another way is by watching the lives of his people. You know, we live holy, righteous lives. That's attractive to people, and the people that God is calling to himself, they'll see that, they'll say, I want that. The world in general won't like it, they'll hate it, but certain people who are being called by God, they'll be attracted by that, and they'll see your life, and they'll say, I want that. I want that for myself. Okay, so next time I plan to go deeper into this concept of knowledge of God and how to get more of it and all that, what it is. But until then, let's just remember that we got plenty to remember just from this verse. First, the goal. Don't forget the goal. Godliness. Living in the presence of God, feeling the right way about his attributes. I can't impress on you enough how helpful I've found that. Living in the presence of God, feeling the right way about his attributes, the right attitude. And when that's your spiritual goal, stop looking at that goal like a barbell that you can lift if you just hit the gym, and look at it like the jumbo jet that it is. It's like, I can't even begin. That I'm going to need superpower for that. Then we'll stop looking at our own strength and we'll start turning our attention to divine power. And how do you get that divine power? Knowledge of God. Knowledge of God. The answer to every spiritual problem is, oh man, I need a deeper knowledge of God. Every time you fall into sin, remind yourself, that wouldn't have happened if I would have had deeper knowledge of God. If I knew him better. Every spiritual struggle, solution is deeper knowledge of God. Someone you know has a problem, what they need is deeper knowledge of God. Starting place for that deeper knowledge are these attributes. Give some deep, extended, profound thought to the fact that God called you to himself. And the way he did it was by opening your eyes to his magnificence, the magnificence of his own glory and moral perfection.